I'm Logan Loya, and I'm here with,
Chris Stiles.
and you're listening to Terror Talk. So today we're gonna go more into the behind the scenes of horror films, and what type of shots do you look for, or audio or editing do you like to see in horror movies?
Well, I put horror movies to the same standard as all the other movies. I like to see really good shots, and I really look forward in horror movies to some creative shots, which I think probably horror movies are one of the, not going to say pioneers necessarily, but horror looked for different types of ways of scaring people, making people uneasy, and I think they were more creative with shots and probably created or found ways to do shots that led into other genres too.
Yeah, some shots that I love to see are some that start off upside down, and as somebody walks underneath the camera, it goes right side up.
Right, yeah. What movie was it that I told you about that did that? I can't remember, but it was a horror movie, and it did create a very it was the movie Children of Men, and which isn't really a horror movie, but it's a very tense movie, and it created the unease. It was having the character. It was really kind of a transition shot because the character hadn't really quite decided that he was going to help these people, and as the army and the rebels chased them, and it created the transition and some unease. So.
Yeah, other shots that I like to see are some in more psychological horror films, but where they're really close or just really uncomfortable angles.
Right.
And it kind of sets the tone for, I don't know, the feel of the film.
Alfred Hitchcock was really good at that, and I think a lot of modern horror people use what he did. He was very good at focusing on odd things, and he had a way of making them seem like they shouldn't have been important, but the way he framed them, he realized they were important. A good example is the birds. Uh, the horror of the movies, these huge flocks of birds attack people, but the scariest parts of the movie were when the birds were doing nothing, and the people were just in anticipation for them attacking again. And he was just really good at framing these birds in different angles and on jungle gyms.
Mm-hmm.
And it really built the tension.
Yeah, especially I know one of the shots where it's on a playground where every time it cuts back to the shot, there's more and more birds.
Yeah.
And so once they get out of the school, and then the flock starts attacking,
Mm-hmm.
and it's really good to start tension. And another way that horror films use tension, sometimes a little too much, is the sound, or kind of the music.
Right.
Because I know in Hereditary, there's this uncomfortable pitch throughout the entire film, and you don't really realize it's there.
Yeah. What was the name of that? We just looked that up the other day. Some sort of loop. And it always builds up to where you think it's going to stop, but it just loops back and just keeps building and building. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, it can be used too much. It's good when it's there to build the tension, but it can go overboard.
And I feel usually when a jump scare happens, you know it's going to happen because the music always starts to ramp up.
Right.
But I feel like if the music doesn't change at all and only spikes when the jump scare happens,
Yeah.
that would be a better way to use the sound effect.
Right. Yeah.
Because I know they did something like that in Smile, when the main character thinks she hears something on a recording, and she keeps replaying it and then slowing it down, and then at a really long slowdown, once it hits, there's a jump scare, and it was a really good scare in that film.
Yeah, I was thinking of sound. I was thinking of the scene in Sixth Sense when he's listening to the tape recording of one of his old patients and realizing that on that tape were very, very quiet ghost voices. I realized for the first time that patient of his was hearing dead people, but it built it up by just played the tape, and all you could hear was hiss, and he kept turning it up a little more, and you thought you could hear it, and after a while, you definitely could hear it. But just the way it built up with volume really added to the tension. And
Yeah, and then there's certain editing I feel can really make a horror movie, especially with shots that I feel like some shots that feel really cool in horror movies is just like if it's a long shot when it's just daytime and then cuts to black like right away. I feel like those are really nice shots.
yeah, yeah. I was trying to think of some more Alfred Hitchcock. The way he framed people in Rear Window, because literally framed them with windows. The guy was, Jimmy Stewart's character was sitting there watching different people, and you had like several little stories going on, and it started kind of light. There's the sexy woman that he kind of liked to watch, and then there's a couple fighting, but they weren't really fighting about anything, and then suddenly you see a guy seemingly murdered his wife. I was like, but all those stories are just there on the screen popping around. That was a good way to frame that.
Yeah, there's also a movie called Fresh, where like it starts out as a woman trying to find a date, and then she meets somebody, and then all of a sudden it cuts to like this guy she met is not a serial killer, but he kidnaps women and sells their body parts on like the black market for food.
Okay.
And it's a really, because it starts off like a love story, like you wouldn't tell that it's a horror film, and then it just a quick drop to when the guy drugs the woman and she wakes up in a basement.
Right.
And the script did it really well, and it felt like once the horror started, it felt really tense and horrifying.
Yeah, the basement's a good transition too, because nothing good ever happens in a basement, and so that's all you have to do is just change your setting. And it's like we're in a park. Now we're in a basement.
Yeah, and a similar situation happened in a movie called Barbarian, where there's this woman who's going to this Airbnb that she rented, and when she gets there, there's already a man inside, and it's he uses an excuse like it was on some other website that he already rented out, but it was a very odd situation, and it felt tense the entire time, but he was actually a good guy, and once the woman finds a secret basement during the next day, and the guy goes down there and she finds his body, and then we hard cut to another new character who owns the house, and then he finds what all happened, and he's a terrible person.
Yeah.
But like I like horror films that feel like it's a romance or not a horror film, and then it just
switches.
Hard switch.
Yeah, I think even Happy Death Day.
Yeah.
It's. I mean, even though you can't, I don't think anybody would go into it not knowing what the premise is, but it still starts out light and fluffy, and kind of keeps, even when the first murder happens, it's still kind of lighthearted, but it just gets darker and darker as the movie goes on.
I liked the first Happy Death Day. I thought it was murder Groundhog Day.
Yeah, right.
Which was very interesting. And then you had the second one.
Yeah.
Where it goes into multiverse and
Yeah.
it gets really wild and stupid.
I didn't like the second one either. In fact, I don't even think I finished it.
I don't blame you.
Yeah.
And a movie, other types I like, or like where it does not have a happy ending. I feel, because like it makes the horror even worse.
Right.
Like Smile does it, and then Smile 2 did it again, but in a new way, and it was, the Smile movies are just wild.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they're really well made horror films.
Right. Let's think like you're talking about not a happy ending. Hitchcock's Psycho.
Yeah.
And they caught him, but I mean, he's still very mentally ill. He's still, I mean, he thinks he's his mother. And
Mhm.
it's also not a happy ending because he successfully makes you side with him as the movie's going along. You're kind of rooting for him, like, oh, hide the body. And
Yeah.
so at the end, it's like, oh, he's spending the rest of his life in a mental institution, and you kind of feel bad for him. So,
Yeah, and like Psycho started the like what Scream did later on was, you think this first person who dies right away is like the main character because she's on all like the posters, she has most screen time in the trailer, and then you get to the film and then she dies almost instantly.
right, yeah, that was quite a switch. It's kind of interesting when I watch it with students, and I don't tell them anything, and all of a sudden they're going, hey, what do you think she's dead?
Yeah,
It's like,
it's and Psycho has probably the most uh one of the best soundtracks for like a murder,
definitely,
and
yeah.
you can recognize it
Yeah.
from anything. Even if you haven't seen Psycho or you're not big into horror, you know what it's from.
Right. Yeah. And that the entire, there's the murder you're talking about, the
Mhm.
but the entire soundtrack is very good at building tension because it's very frantic violin music, dun, 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 and it never lets up. Yeah, it's like, yeah, every time they're, especially when they're in cars, every time they're in their car, it goes dun 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 dun, and
Yeah.
you're always tense.
A soundtrack can really make or break a horror film.
Definitely, yeah.
And some of my favorite soundtracks in any horror movie is John Carpenter's movies.
Mm-hmm.
Like I just watched The Fog, and that one has a really nice soundtrack to it. And then his most popular, which is Halloween, which another very popular theme song that
Yeah.
you can pick out from anywhere.
Right, yeah. Very much so.
And it's John Carpenter's films also have like John Carpenter's Halloween started the whole slasher
Mhm.
subgenre, and he also made The Thing, which is one of the most popular horror films.
Yeah, I love that movie.
And he did so much new with that film, and it has another really good jump scare when they're all like testing their own blood to see who's who's the monster, and then I haven't seen it in a while, but I'm pretty sure it's like very quiet, and then they test the one guy's blood and it reacts and attacks, and it's a really well done scene.
Yeah. I was just thinking of the type of jump scare that turns out to be like a dream or something early in the movie that happens, and oh, it's okay. And the first thing I thought of was second Aliens, and Sigourney Weaver is sleeping, but you don't know she's sleeping. She has a dream and that the alien comes out of her, and then she wakes up suddenly because you're thinking at first like, whoa, this movie's starting quick, and like, oh,
Yeah.
it's just a dream. Good.
Yeah, especially and like with the Final Destination films,
Mhm.
they always start with the person having a premonition about the big, like plane crash in the first one, or I don't know, like the amusement park scenes,
Mhm.
which the new one of Final Destination is coming out soon, which it looks very interesting,
Yeah.
and it's the Final Destination series I feel starts to fall off after 4. So I'm hoping that this one can kind of bring it back,
Right.
and maybe being the last Final Destination film, because I know like there's not much you can do with the series after a while, and it starts to fall off, like
Yeah.
with like Halloween or Friday the 13th.
Yeah. Or Nightmare on Elm Street, and
I don't really care too much for the Nightmare on Elm Street films, because I feel the only good ones are 1 and 2, and then Dream Warriors wasn't too bad. And then you have my favorite one is Wes Craven's New Nightmare, which is
okay.
one of the newest ones.
Yeah. I always liked Nightmare on Elm Street, just in little bits and pieces. Like they were always playing like an HBO, and when I was younger, and I would just watch 15 minutes of it and then watch somebody get murdered, and it was like, yeah, that's okay. But I didn't really want to watch the whole movie.
Yeah, and it's a terrifying topic. I mean,
Yeah,
like
yeah.
you're sleeping, and when you wake up, still like have the big scratch, and that I feel like that would be a horrifying thing to realize.
Right, right.
And then another like movie that I think has like a really had a really big impact, but they haven't really done anything with it since is Creepshow.
Okay, yeah.
Because like they had the whole like comic book style, and I love Creepshow, but
Right.
there's not really a horror movie who's tried to do the same thing.
No, maybe not, yeah.
And the I like the effects of like the comic, how like the shot kind of comes out and it's like a comic panel, and then pages flip and then it goes back into the comic,
Mm-hmm, yeah.
which is a really cool and interesting like way to have a movie.
I was trying to think of some of the stuff that terrified me as a kid, because first horror movies I saw were on a small black and white TV in the 60s, and so yeah, you weren't in a big theater or watching a big screen, so it was more of a challenge to be scared, I think.
Mm-hmm.
I remember a movie called Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, which I watched a clip of recently, and I thought, that is the stupidest thing I've ever seen. And but it was terrifying as a kid, just on this little screen. You know, she's walking around and tearing telephone wires down, and I'm not sure what it made it so scary on a small screen, but it did. I remember seeing Psycho was on a small screen, and then it was terrifying.
And then it's definitely like some films that were horrifying back then than they are now, because they've done so much new and more terrifying things. And like Jaws was one of is the scariest movie of its like time.
Yeah.
Which nowadays it's not really scary at all, because after that came like serial killers and
Right. Although going back to the music, and Jaws was one of the brilliant pioneers in using music to determine, you knew when that shark was coming. You couldn't see the shark,
but you heard the music.
You didn't know, there's several people in the water. You didn't know who the shark was gonna get, but you knew the shark was out there, and it created a lot of tension.
And it makes the music almost feel like another character.
Yeah, yeah.
And I feel like if the camera spends less time on the killer,
Mm-hmm.
it could make a film or a horror film a lot more scary, because you don't know what's attacking them.
Right. And that's kind of way Jaws worked, and still works somewhat today, because the shark really wasn't on screen a lot, and not until the end when they kill it. And even then, I mean, it was mostly a fin that you saw, or unseen, and it was the music. You were seeing things through the shark's eyes, looking up at the boat and whatever. So
Yeah, which is some of the shots John Carpenter used with Michael Myers.
yeah,
Is like the entire first, I don't know, 10 minutes of the film, you're in the eyes of the little kid Michael Myers killing his sister.
right, yeah,
And I think that's just a really interesting way to use horror.
yeah,
And another thing is, like with Smile, you don't see the monster, but you see what the monster slowly driving the person insane, and you don't see the
Oh.
monster until the last few minutes of both films.
okay, yeah.
And which I think that's about all the time we have for today.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Mr. Stiles, for
Thank you
joining me.
for having me. It was fun. Yeah.
I've been Logan Loya,
I've been Chris Stiles.
and you've been listening to Terror Talk.